Welcome, everybody. My name is Suzanne Morin. This is CANON's second formal online event. The first one we had was just a little over a year ago when we held a COVID-19 mini summit. I'm going to dispense with formal introductions for everybody. Suffice it to say, we have an awesome group of panelists today. After a short introduction about CANON that Adam will give, we're going to dive into the findings from CANON's study of practices for generating non-identifiable data. Then we're going to follow that with a brief discussion of some of the impacts on the regulatory reform front. Then we're going to have a view into the standards development world. So we've got a great lineup. And we want to save some time for Q&A. So I'll be sure to keep everyone on time. But please, like always, please do enter questions you might have in the Q&A. And, you have anything you want to put in the chat, do that as well. I'm going to moderate those. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. To set the stage for the presentation by Khaled, which is going to be the key focus of today's session, I want to provide a little bit of context and level set for everyone, a little bit of background information about CANON, which has been established as with a fundamental purpose to promote anonymization and de-identification as a respectful means for leveraging data for economic and socially beneficial purposes. And as many of you might be aware, CANON is now a registered not-for-profit corporation overseen by a steering committee of just a superb set of large data custodians, representatives from those data custodians, who contributed funds, significant funds, as seed financing for the not-for-profit initiative, as well as a real substantial amount of time and effort to help us achieve the objectives for the community. On our website, as you may have seen, and I encourage you to go to the website at de-identified.ca, the steering committee has articulated objectives, very defined objectives, which in essence, very, very briefly, is to not just share and exchange information, but really to demystify that information about internationally evolving legal policy and technical standards, develop a community of practice and community of practice among key stakeholders that are relying on anonymization and de-identification, education efforts, identify emerging issues, and advocacy. And we committed to very specific deliverables on our website. And the group in CANON generally has been active. If you refer during this session or afterwards to the activities and initiatives, a portion of our website, and you will see that first we have an external set of resources, 50, 60 resources relating to internationally, domestic and international guidance documents and other publications regarding anonymization and de-identification. It's very helpful for us to refer to, excellent reference, and it's serving various purposes. There's a FAQ that we worked on. There's a very interesting deliverable data point on the concept of states of data, which really sets out a helpful brief document on what we'll call a spectrum of identifiability that's been really helpful for our discussions on a number of efforts. And as Suzanne mentioned, there's the reference, and you can hyperlink to the previous session. And we've been involved in advocacy. There's been a consultation participation by CANON to ISED, and most recently, there was a submission made to the Ontario government in connection with at that time, it was perhaps a legislative reform effort, but it turned out to be very much the case, as many of you are aware, the release of the white paper. And certainly many of us were happy to see that it appears that certain concepts that we raised in our submission found their way into the discussion document. So we're happy and to be of use and of assistance as part of that effort. And the most recent initiative, which leads to our session today, is really fundamentally premised on a concept of use cases, which we agreed at the steering committee level when we were articulating the objectives that we're not going to achieve these objectives unless we focus on practical use cases to help explore this quite nuanced topic, this challenging topic, this challenging concept of de-identification and anonymization. And that's what we are here to discuss today, and really turn it over now to Khaled to talk about an initiative. As Khaled will explain, we applied to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's contribution program. We received funding for this. And I'm going to turn it over to Khaled right now to take us through a presentation on the report of the finding on our study. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And Khaled, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Adam. What I will be talking to you about over the next 30 or 35 minutes is giving you a summary of the report that we submitted to the Office of the Privacy Commissioners of Canada's with respect to our project that they funded as part of the contributions program. I'll stick to the main document that was submitted with minimal annotations from myself, and then maybe during the discussions or Q&A, I and the rest of the panel can add some color to some of the findings as well. So the report is available on our website. You can go there and download it. And just as a bit of background, CANON has been hearing from its members, as well as the broader community, that there is a desire to implement strong practices for rendering data to be non-identifiable and to help facilitate socially and economically beneficial yet privacy protective uses of data. While we encouraged the more widespread and consistent adoption of privacy-enhancing technologies that can render information to be non-identifiable, there were challenges, including ambiguity in the legal and policy norms and standards, a lack of operational technical guidance around best practices and resources, and there are also the highly publicized identification attacks, which muddy the waters about what works and what doesn't. So as a first step to address these challenges, we did this study to understand the current practices used by Canadian organizations to render data to be non-identifiable. These organizations represent some of the most sophisticated users of data in the country and have invested heavily in doing so, in using data for secondary purposes in a responsible manner. So the overall process we used in the preparation of this report, there were four main steps. The first one was a definition of terminology, which we realized early on was quite a critical thing to get to, and then we defined a number of use cases, 5 use cases, which characterize the typical use cases for data uses, internal and external data uses. And then we interviewed members of CANON who volunteered, and we identified or developed 7 case studies that demonstrate the use cases. And these really give a concrete picture of how organizations that are using and processing data are creating non-identifiable data sets and operationalizing the concepts around non-identifiable data in practice, and the trade-offs and the approaches that were taken. And then at the end, we have from these case studies, we distilled a series of lessons learned around data uses and creating non-identifiable data sets in practice. So I'll go through each one of those 4 components, summarizing the learnings that are documented in the report. And then, of course, we'll have our Q&A. So in terms of basic terminology, this is where we landed. So identifiability falls on a spectrum, and there's a threshold somewhere along this spectrum which separates data from being personal information to not personal information. And you have along the spectrum, you have variations in identifiability, but you also have variations in data utility, where data that is more identifiable has higher utility, and data that's less identifiable also has lower data utility. So that's the trade-off between identifiability and utility. And then we have three states of data: the identified information, which this information by itself directly identifies an individual; identifiable information, which is information for which there is a serious possibility in the circumstances that it could be associated with an identifiable individual; and then non-identifiable information for which there is no serious possibility in the circumstances that it could be associated with an identifiable individual. So these were the three terms that we landed on. And there are a couple of clarifications that are needed on this. The first is the phrase "in the circumstances" involves consideration of contextual factors. And the term in the circumstances is part of the definition of identifiable information. And the contextual factors include likelihood that an actor will attempt to identify the information, what other data sets are accessible to an adversary who might be able to combine that with the information, and the environment in which the information will be used or into which the information will be released, and any other controls that may be in place. So really take into account the context of the processing of the information that's going to be of the information that's going to be that we're talking about. There are also some additional considerations. One is that we assume that multiple techniques can be used to make information non-identifiable. For example, aggregation, synthetic data generation, fully or partially homomorphic encryption, and so on. So this is not limited to, the definitions were designed not to limit the techniques to any specific one. Really, we wanted to make it open to pets in general. And also we recommend against the use of the terms anonymous and anonymization, and you see that those terms are not included here. There are a number of reasons for this decision. One is that the term has been used in the past to convey a range of meanings, that its use has created confusion rather than clarity. And it's also sometimes used to mean the case where there is no possibility of identification or zero risk. And this is an unattainable standard in practice, and therefore it's used to describe an impossible standard. Therefore, we don't include definitions for anonymous or anonymization in this basic terminology. A comment has been made that for Canadian companies operating globally, and especially in Europe, they need to use this term and in Europe, and specifically use it in the context of contracts. In such a case, the term would be used, would need to be defined precisely, because standalone, it's a very loaded term. It has multiple meanings, as I mentioned. And outside the contractual context, as I mentioned, we recommend avoiding using that term. So these are the three states of data and the three terms that we have used in this report, and that the members of CANON have settled on. So that's the terminology part, a kind of basic terminology part. The next one are the use cases. So I'll just quickly walk through the 5 use cases that we used, and these are intended to characterize very common ways in which data is used and processed. So the first one is creating open data, where personal information goes through a process of making it non-identifiable. And then you have 2 types of open data or releases: public release and quasi-public release. Public release is really where there are no constraints on the information, and the data is just posted essentially online for download by anyone. And there's no requirement to register or to identify yourself when you download this data. With quasi-public release, you have some kind of controls in place. Typically, you have to identify yourself, and the identity would be verified, and you'd have some basic terms of use, maybe a click-through terms of use to indicate that you've accepted some restrictions on the access to the data, such as a requirement that the data users do not attempt to identify any of the records in the data set. So that's the first case, use case, open data. Once released, the organization will have little control over that data. And because the risk is managed only through, or largely through, transformations of the data, and no controls in public release and minimal controls in quasi-public release, the data utility will be affected more severely than other use cases because you're really relying on the data transformations to manage the risk. So in terms of risk management practices for open data, you can apply a motivated intruder test or do a motivated intruder attack to evaluate empirically how easy it is to identify individuals in the data set. And you can continually monitor the availability of other data sets that can be used in potential attacks, for example, and pull data back if the risk become too high. But that's a weak risk management technique because once the data is out, there'll be multiple copies of it floating around. So motivated intruder tests are a good approach for managing these types of risk in addition to applying traditional methods, PETs, to create non-identifiable data. The second use case is external data sharing. So the data custodian or controller would render the data to be non-identifiable using one or more PETs. And then there will typically be a contract in place to share the data with an external party. And within that contract, you would have stipulations around controls, security controls, privacy controls, and also restrictions on what can be done with the data, such as a prohibition on attempts at re-identification. And there may be also audit requirements in these contracts to ensure that the external party implements the controls and maintains those controls over time. So that's another typical use case for external data sharing. The third one is external access. So with external access, you provide access to the data, for example, through a secure virtual environment or safe haven of some sort, but you don't actually share the data with an external party. So an external party can physically or virtually come into a secure bubble and access the data there, or they can query a database remotely or even physically in the same spot, but query a database, but don't get actually and get query results, aggregate statistics from that database, but don't actually get access to the personal information. Under this use case, the custodian maintains control of the data. This is a costly approach because you have to maintain a secure environment of some sort. And the challenge with this type of approach is if you're providing the computing environment for people, users, and external parties to work with data, then you also have to incur the computing costs. And with current AI and machine learning and deep learning methods, these computing costs can be quite expensive. And in some cases, just not available. High performance computing capacity is not typically provided through these remote access environments. So that may put some limits on the types of analysis that can be performed. But it's a good way for many types of requirements. It's a good way to make data accessible to external parties. And then, of course, for external parties, when they pull data out, you'd have to review or check what they're pulling out, what information they're taking out to avoid information leakage. And of course, and the data that's shared in these secure havens has to be also non-identifiable to some extent. It's not directly identifiable, identified or identifiable data. It'll be non-identifiable to some extent as well as an additional security measure. The next use case is where you have multiple parties. So there are two scenarios here. One is where you have a trusted third party or trusted agent, which has authority to access the personal information, and the trusted agent would create the non-identifiable data and then share it with the external party. Or the data custodians can create the non-identifiable data, share it with a trusted agent who then links it together. But typically the trusted agent is trusted because they get access to the personal information and they perform the linking and creating the non-identifiable data. And then they're the ones who make it available externally to external parties. The second panel shows a more complex scenario. Here you're looking at typically some form of secure multi-party computation where multiple parties collaborate in order to perform computations and then return the results to one of the parties or a different party. And there are various techniques that have been developed for this. Both of those approaches are complicated in the sense that, for a trusted agent who's linking or pooling data, they have to be highly secure, create a highly secure environment. And then for the secure multi-party computation environment, just multiple issues around auditing multiple sites or multiple parties, have complex authentication mechanisms because you have intermediate information passing through multiple sites, need to coordinate computations, etc. So these are approaches that have been used. Trusted third parties are more common. Secure multi-party computation is starting to pick up. And it's suitable for certain types of analyses that are well-defined in advance. The next use case is internal processing. And so you would have personal information that is then rendered to be non-identifiable within an organization. Then the organization uses that information for some form of analysis. One of the questions that has come up with this setup, certainly from some DPAs in Europe, and also mentioned in an Article 29 Working Party document from a few years ago, that an entity that has the personal information and the non-identifiable information means that you cannot have the non-identifiable information would not be recognized as non-identifiable if the personal information exists within the same entity, which excludes the ability of many types of organizations from having non-identifiable information or data that can be claimed to be non-identifiable information, such as academic medical centers. As a simple example, they need to provide care with personal information, but also they conduct research with non-identifiable information. So that view is typically cannot be followed in practice. It's not a practical approach. In practice, what you would typically have are firewalls or separations between the entity or part of the organization that's processing personal information and the part of the organization that's processing the non-identifiable information. And the level of separation between those two can vary and can be defined, but there's typically a reasonable separation to enable non-identifiable information to exist within the same organization that has that's processing the personal information. But this is the internal processing use case. So from those 5 use cases, we ended up developing, as part of the project, 7 case studies which operationalize in practice these use cases, and they cover multiple industries: healthcare, tech, financial services, transportation, logistics, and telcos. So I'll walk you quickly through those case studies. I think these are really informative case studies because they show how in practice organizations are creating non-identifiable data and using non-identifiable data, and the approaches they have used, and the rationale and the trade-offs that they made along the way to balance privacy and responsible data use with the business needs. And all of these are described in the report as well. So I will just give you a high-level overview of each one, and then we'll go to the overall findings after that. So the first one is the digital solutions for the prevention of the spread of and for the treatment of COVID-19. So in this particular case study, an organization sponsored a development of an app that collects personal information from patients or individuals who've contracted COVID-19. And the idea here is that these patients would provide ongoing information about their symptoms and their moods, and then that data would be provided with consent to researchers and made available for secondary analysis. And the data is rendered non-identifiable by the app developer themselves, and then a synthetic version of that data set is then created, and that data set then with kind of doubly protected data set is then shared for broader use by analysts and AI researchers to see what they can learn from that information. So the creation of non-identifiable data is performed effectively at source, followed by the synthetic data generation. One comment that came out of this case study, which was interesting, is that despite the lack of regulatory guidance on methods to create non-identifiable data, the sense of urgency created by COVID-19 did help move things forward relatively quickly within the organization to launch this initiative. So that was an interesting observation. The second case study, the second one on this slide, key performance indicator design and data transformation tactics for securely reporting non-identifying data on patient support programs to pharmaceutical companies. So the basic idea here is you have patient support programs which collect data from patients to understand or collect data on adverse events, number of visits to their doctor, to collect data on adherence, whether they continue to taking the treatment or a drug, and if they stop, why they stop. So this data is collected by frontline workers and then is aggregated into KPIs and then dashboards, and then that information is sent to the pharmaceutical companies, the KPIs and the dashboards, to provide them feedback on how patients are using their medications, and also, of course, about adverse events. And one of the interesting things here is that the creating non-identifiable data is performed by frontline workers in terms of the types of information they can collect and they can enter into the data collection systems, which require training of the frontline workers to ensure that they follow the protocols. And this is relevant for some of our findings at the end as well. Another case study is this from a organization that wanted to create a 360 view of clients. And in this particular case, a data lake was created by breaking the silos of databases and data marts across the organization into a single data lake. Once the data is in the data lake, there are multiple tiers or multiple zones of identifiability. So you have the raw data, you have pseudonymous data, and then you have role-based access that sits on top of it, where certain cuts of the data are made available to the analysts to perform the work that they need to do, the analysis that they reporting that they need to do. So a couple of controls are implemented in data lakes, and this type of data lake. One is approvals for accessing the data, role-based access, logging and monitoring of data uses, and then PIAs are performed for advanced analytics projects, so that analysts cannot just take data; they have to perform a PIA for these more advanced uses of those data sets. What I found interesting also from this case study is the analysis that went into it to determine what was a primary use and what was a secondary use of data, because that informed the controls that were put in place and the processes used and the level of non-identifiability, where you are on the spectrum for different uses of the data set in the data lake. The other interesting observation is around centralization that came out from this case study, that centralization was very helpful to ensure that there are consistent privacy practices across the organization. Instead of having multiple data silos, it's easier to ensure consistency when you have data in one place, such as in a data lake. The next case study is use of data-driven insights to inform credit provisioning strategies. So this is a financial use case. So data comes in from financial institutions. It's linked with other data sets pertaining to individuals within organization D. Analysis is performed, and then reports are sent back, or other types of information is sent back to the financial institution. And along the way, the data is rendered non-identifiable within organization D, so that the analyst there cannot determine the identity of the individuals that the financial institution is providing information on. And then the next case study is utilizing aggregate data for the optimization of patient care and management. So this is data collected from primary care clinics, from the electronic medical records, where data is pulled in and analyzed, and then aggregate reports are produced back to the clinics themselves about how their practice is doing, but also to compare and clinics' performance, or at least benchmark in the sense that a clinic can see how well it's doing against its peers on various indicators, and to perform population level analysis as well across multiple clinics. And the various forms of techniques, or different types of techniques, are performed to create non-identifiable data and to ensure that the reports that are sent back or made available to the data users do not leak personal information. The next one is the use of analytics to understand the impact of COVID-19 on trade activity and commercial transportation economic recovery. So this is telematics information from trucks to understand the movement of goods across North America. And data was collected and made available to different types of users through a web portal. After they go through a process of making them non-identifiable. I think the one interesting part of this case study is the performance of a motivated intruder attack on the data set to validate that it's difficult to re-identify individuals in the data that is shared. Telematics data is, because it has time and location, it's over time, so it's more challenging to work with from a privacy perspective. But in this case study, they describe how they were able to do that and manage the risks, re-identification risks, to allow them to share this data. The next case study is predicting customer perceptions of telecom service reliability. So this is I call it a hackathon, but case study describes it as a challenge where organization G is providing information on the reliability of services and satisfaction as part of these challenges that are run by a research institute, and research participants then get access to the data. So these are the research participants who are given credentials by the research institute, and they can only access the data from within that one physical location. One interesting thing in this case study is risks were classified into 4 tiers. So tier 4 is identifiable information, and the research institute would not accept tier 4 data for challenges. For tier 2 and tier 3 data sets, certain levels of rendering the data to be non-identifiable would have to be applied before the data is made available for research participants or the analysts who are participating in these challenges. So there's a form of a risk scale characterizing different types of data and rules around the use or non-use of each one of these different types of data sets. So these were the 7 case studies. And again, more details in the report, but I think they give quite a good overview of what's done in practice and the trade-offs and the balancing that has to happen to ensure that beneficial uses of data are actually occurring, and of course to also ensure that Canadian organizations are able to compete globally. So some of the learnings from this, one is that the layering of pets, so more than one privacy enhancing technology can be used. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and combining them can be an advantage. And there's some examples of that. Different techniques have been used in practice: suppression, noise addition, rounding, generalization, and so on. Synthetic data generation for the first case study. So these are just examples of some of the approaches that have been used in practice. So broad set of techniques, basically. The tiered risk levels based on identifiability, that was the last case study we looked at. So risk management approaches that are qualitative as well as some quantitative ones are used to manage the risk. Motivated intruder tests are used as well as a form of stress tests to ensure that it's, or to provide feedback on how easy or difficult it is to identify individuals in data sets. I think they're a very powerful tool, a complement to traditional approaches that are typically used, and especially for complex data sets, they can be quite helpful. And for public data releases, they're also highly recommended. Data consolidation makes creating non-identifiable data much easier because you have a centralized place where you can apply consistent policies across the board for all data sets and all data uses. So that's a strategy that makes a lot of sense in practice. And then, of course, uses of different types of controls, data sharing agreements, security and privacy assessments. All of these are complementary to data transformations as well in practice as ways to manage the overall risks of using and of sharing data sets. And in terms of the challenges, I think one thing to highlight is data can be used for good, and there are specific data for good programs, but many data uses are also beneficial for society, in addition to providing economic benefit to the organizations themselves. And the second point is that it's much easier to implement data analytics and secondary use programs if you have a privacy program already in place, because you have the foundations and the framework and the understanding and the culture within the organization to make those secondary data uses easier to implement and to do so responsibly. The importance of internal collaboration across functions was emphasized, IT, legal, privacy, business units, etc., where that internal collaboration has been facilitated. It made it a lot easier to put in place programs to enable the uses and secondary uses of data. A big factor, of course, is the risk appetite of the organization, and there has to be an understanding of what this risk appetite is. It's not a surprise that different organizations have different levels of risk appetite. Some are more willing to take higher levels of risk compared to others. Some are very conservative. And the way the creation of these non-identifiable data sets and the thresholds that are used and the techniques that are used will be a function of the risk appetite. So that there has to be an understanding of that to ensure that the final processes put in place make sense for a particular organization. And they won't be the same across organizations, I mean, as we saw. Automation is needed. That's, I think, an obvious thing. Part of it is the volumes of data that are involved, but the processes to create non-identifiable data are becoming more complex as well, and therefore should expect that some automation is needed to make this work in practice. One of the challenges is access to privacy talent and individuals who have the expertise to create non-identifiable data sets. So that was brought up. And then privacy law was also brought up in the sense that there has to be a more explicit accounting for controls as mechanisms to manage risk, and that one size does not fit all, in the sense that, in the circumstances, I mentioned that at the beginning in our definitions, the context matters, and how that's taken into account and the controls that are put in place are important as well in defining what's acceptable and what's not. And I think we saw examples of that throughout our case studies. The global privacy landscape, because of inconsistencies across the different jurisdictions, it makes implementing a globally successful or globally applicable privacy program more costly, which penalizes small organizations who do not necessarily have the resources to implement, to meet all the requirements that are not necessarily aligned. The processes for creating non-identifiable data should be simplified, or there should be simplified versions, especially when you have to create the non-identifiable data at the front line. So you have frontline workers who may be nurses or study coordinators in the examples we saw here, who are not experts on identifiability, not experts on privacy, but they need to understand how to create collect non-identifiable data for at source. So simplification is certainly important in this to make this work under some use cases. And then a last comment is sometimes privacy is used as an excuse, and the real issue is control of the data. When folks say, privacy is preventing or is an obstacle, it's not necessarily the reason why. That may not be the main challenge or the main obstacle to making a program succeed. So that's a summary. Hopefully, I gave you an accurate and complete picture of the report. And just want to acknowledge the team that participated. So Paige Moira from PwC, who was seconded to us for this project, conducted the interviews. So I'd like to thank her. Vance Lockton, who was working with CANON at the time. He's no longer working with CANON at this point. He joined the Privacy Commissioner's office, but wish to thank him as well. Elizabeth Junker, who was also seconded from CHIO for the duration of this project. And of course, Adam, who already presented earlier on, and then the remaining, the other members of the CANON steering group who have been very helpful in reviewing this report, as well as, of course, providing the case studies. So we'd like to acknowledge all of their contributions. I think now it's time for questions.
Great, thanks, Khaled. And it's interesting that you came across privacy as something that gets in the way, when actually I think taking privacy head on can actually be an enabler for a lot of these initiatives. We do have a few questions, and maybe I'll start. John Wunderlich had a couple for you. Going way back to the beginning of your presentation, he was asking about in the circumstances. Does it mean the same thing as operational context in ISO 20889? You're a standards person, you might know that.
I think yes. I mean, it's the conceptually yes. I think that I would say that's the answer. I think at the detailed level in this context, in the circumstances, mean security and privacy controls, contractual controls. So maybe a bit more specific than what ISO had in mind, but what ISO standard had in mind. But conceptually yes. Okay.
And he had another one, differential privacy. How would you apply that to your use cases?
Well, none of the organizations that were covered here were using differential privacy at that point in time, but it would be considered as another privacy-enhancing technology that can be used to create non-identifiable data. So I mean, I think it fits in. It's not just because it's not mentioned, it doesn't mean it's excluded. It's just that at that point in time, there were no examples of it being applied.
Yeah, and he was referring to local differential privacy versus central differential privacy. Have to admit, I'm not quite sure what that means.
Well, I mean, if you create differentially private, let's say microdata or data for release, and again, it's another pet that can be used for data sharing, and it's one option. I mean, it's available. I think the U.S. Census Bureau, for example, is creating essentially differentially private synthetic data to release census, the 2020 census data. So there are big examples of this happening. It has come with its own controversy, but it's an example of this kind of public data release. So I would say it's another privacy-enhancing technology that can be applied here. I think which type of differential privacy you use at the end of the day, whether it's interactive or microdata release, will depend on the workflow and the business problem you're trying to address.
Okay, thanks. And actually, we had one more question in the Q&A. Someone was asking that what maybe feels missing is a perspective of the data subject themselves. How do you think about things like consent and purpose limitation within data sharing models? I think from reading your report, Khaled, that some of those actually were covered, but what more might you add?
Well, I think in the case studies, I mean, there was consent was taken into account, and I think in all cases, what was permitted, what was not, and I think also purpose limitation was taken into account. But even with purpose limits, data, if you have data minimization in place and you collect the minimal amount of data, you can still find identify secondary purposes for that data. And the whole point of creating non-identifiable data is that you can use the data for different types of purposes. So than the ones for which the data was collected. But of course, these things are always considered, and the definition or drawing the line between primary and secondary uses is also critical. And we saw some examples, it's documented in the case studies where this is explicitly considered and drove some of the decisions around the extent of transformations and modifications that are done to the data to make them non-identifiable.
Perfect. We've actually covered the questions and we're right on time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to make some connections with some of the regulatory implications. Khaled referred to the impacts of this work on, the GDPR, companies who are also subject to the GDPR, but there are different regulatory implications that we're seeing here in Canada based on proposed legislation. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you. The concepts of de-identification are really a key, if not a central feature of legislative reform efforts. Certainly, they've been a key focus of discussions. If you read the text of C11, read the text of C11, which is the federal government's proposed replacement of PIPEDA, you read the text of Bill 64, and then most recently, the Ontario's white paper consultation for proposed privacy legislation. You see these concepts of de-identification manifesting itself in multiple respects. You peel back the onion on this. There is, and many of these are reflected in exactly what Khaled went through in different aspects of this report. There is the concept of the states of data, personal information. There's, in some cases, as is the case, for instance, in the white paper, there's a concept of a definition of anonymized data, and then there's de-identified data. So there's at least 3 states of data. And then there's also a reference to the concept, depending on what regime you're looking at, is to de-identification is a process, like the processing of the data or anonymizing, which would render the data, transform the data into either de-identified or anonymous states. And then when you read through the statutory provisions, there's a significant implication of how the terminology could manifest itself. So for instance, data, of course, that's rendered non-identifiable, so it's so-called, in quotes, anonymized, although CANON supports not using that term, but conceptually anonymized, that would limit the scope of the application of the privacy legislative regime. Or there's contemplation, for example, in the white paper, and I think this is the intent of C11. The intent of C11 as well is that there's an intermediate state of de-identified data, which might be akin to something along the lines of pseudonymized data, where it would be less identifiable, but still personal information for the purposes of the statutory regime. And then the implication of that is that certain rules might apply or not apply to those particular states of data. Data that is de-identified might have less security controls that would be required because it would be by definition less sensitive, or there could be other statutory rights that might not apply. For example, C11, data mobility rights. And then you see the concept of de-identification manifesting itself, or de-identified data manifesting itself in conditions for authority for processing, such as exceptions to consent. So C11 and the white paper, Ontario's white paper, both articulate this idea that data would have to be de-identified in order to rely upon an exception to consent for research and development, or to rely on an exception to consent for the disclosure of disclosure of personal information for due diligence in connection with the business transaction, or to complete the closing of that transaction. So a lever for your ability to be able to rely upon those. And then, as Khaled mentioned, data de-identification serves as a technique to achieve data minimization, to align with perhaps what is necessary in the circumstances, either collect, use, or disclose, purpose limitation, as Khaled articulated. And then, of course, de-identification techniques could be used for security to achieve your safeguarding obligations, rendering the data non-identifiable, rendering it less sensitive by applying de-identification techniques. PETs to achieve that would render the data less sensitive and therefore achieving a security objective, if not satisfying a retention obligation by rendering it non-identifiable, would achieve a retention obligation. So there's these nuanced and challenging ways that these concepts appear in the legislation, and they're tricky. And when you look at the lessons learned from this report, they articulate a number of truths that we're experiencing in the course. Many of us on the steering committee for CANON and others that we know who are attending this call, participating in these legislative discussions, are very involved in looking at these proposed legislative schemes or even discussions about concepts. And you see, and it has very significant implications for how we look at and understand, and how we think and how we clarify these terms of very, very significant limitations for privacy law, because it might go to the fundamental point of what the lesson learned that Khaled articulated in the finding, and what the report talks about is you see how de-identification is inextricably linked to the very legitimate uses of data across all these use cases, very inextricably linked to innovation, innovative uses of data, the leveraging of the data, and the broader concept of data for good. The challenges cited or the lessons learned highlight that we just have to be so careful and be so elegant with the drafting. And that's why I think that the diagram that Khaled put up early on about the simplicity way, this simple and elegant way that it was articulated in that states of data, which builds upon the CANON work effort about how we articulate what is identifiable and non-identifiable, and that continuum identifiability. There's a method to the madness of having, so to speak, the elegance of having a very simple way of looking at this, because it gets really complex. This effort highlights, and I think is really important for the legislative reform process, it highlights the desperate need for the application of use cases to show how terms both work, but also how terms might not work, how proposed, however well-intentioned, legislative drafting of concepts or specific provisions might actually not be operational. Khaled gave the most striking point that has really been a focus of CANON from the get-go. If you include a concept of whether it's de-identified or anonymized data, and you draft it in a way that does not take into account the circumstances, this concept of like functional or contextual de-identification, you risk creating a standard for the so-called anonymization of data that is unachievable and impossible. So it's really important, and this highlights the critical need for legislators, government officials, and all of us in the private sector, broader public sector, to bring use cases, as done in this study, to make sure and test these types of legislative schemes. And I think it's not just for statutory construct. I think it's critical for, if there's going to be the development of a code of conduct or a framework or a standard, you have to test that against use cases. This highlights that, or you risk unintended consequences of it not being workable. What it also ends up highlighting, and I think that the lessons learned just brought to fruition, gave evidence to what we at the steering committee found critically important, that is the concept of a risk re-identification framework or some type of governance framework for the actual process is actually essential for an effective, sustainable, long-term, and certainly perceived trustworthy de-identification framework that highlights that. And for that, and the code of practice idea or a framework, et cetera, it's very, very important that both C11 and the white paper give legal integrity, or hopefully will provide a structure for legal integrity of a code of practice. It's hugely helpful, and de-identification is a use case for this. And so this project that was initiated in connection with the contributions project, I think gave evidence for that. The lessons learned, if you read through, talks about the need for interoperability. This is a common theme, not just for de-identification, but it's absolutely critical for the legislative reform efforts that we have terminology. It does not necessarily have to be the exact words, but those concepts have to be interoperable with statutory regimes across the country. And we risk that right now. There's going to be Ontario, there's C11, there's Quebec, there's going to be BC. Soon we'll see Alberta. All of them are using different terminology. That creates uncertainty, reticence, risk, not helpful. So the need for interoperability is highlighted. This report highlights that, and we see that's critical for the legislative reform effort. And the point about the lack of talent in the area, what an issue that we're facing. Those of us in the area, I mean, you can't speak to a professional in the data space that is not underwater right now. I mean, there is already a shortage. Once these legislative schemes come to fruition, which 2 or 3 years, we'll snap our fingers, and many of them, if not across the country, will be in fruition, what you're going to see is a number of challenges, which I think is going to really highlight that all the answers can't be in a legislative statute. I think there's a lot of temptation. You see stakeholders trying to solve all sorts of issues, including broad AI, for instance, and other sort of policy initiatives, and shove them into a statute. Well, the shortage of privacy talent is nothing a statutory framework can do with that, and it highlights the need. There's going to have to be efforts, governmental, federally and provincially, to provide further incentives and policy incentives to support not just de-identification, but broader, but certainly de-identification. And this is why there's an aspect in the Ontario white paper, which was really interesting on this, where it looked at anonymized data as an incentive for innovation, if you read the language. And that really, for those of us on the steering committee, that's a lean forward moment, going, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. But that won't be achieved unless we have the support, not just with statutory frameworks, but government support federally, provincially, for those efforts. And finally, and this really goes on to the raison d'etre for CANON itself, is this, it's not just the use case. There's a reference to collaboration in there, the necessity for that. You can't achieve effective de-identification, work through these challenging issues without multi-stakeholder discussion within organizations, but also cross-sectoral discussions. And that's what CANON has sought to achieve. And we're just so proud of like this amazing membership, the general membership that we have, and actually just kind of wowed about it and the breadth of that. And it just highlights that it can't be done in consultation papers. Like it needs to be discussed. You need the forum for the discuss. You need the community. And so again, it's more than just statutory framework. And I think sometimes we limit ourselves to trying to solve all the issues in law, and it's efforts like CANON. And this gave us a lot of pause to be proud of in terms of, I think we're on the right track, and it further gives impetus for this type of effort. So I wanted to stick within the 10 minutes, Suzanne, so I'll stop there and leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And, we've got some time saved at the end for questions. So over to you, Nadine, for about 15 minutes to talk about, what's going on in the standards world.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm just going to try to share my screen. I'll admit that I'm not super at it when it comes to Zoom. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. Hopefully you can see my screen. What I'm going to do right now is just try to update you on some work that CANON is doing. We are providing some comments on a standard that has been put forward by an organization called the CIO Strategy Council, and they are proposing and looking to publish a standard with respect to de-identification. So just to level set everyone, the CIO Strategy Council is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 2017 by Alex Benet, who at the time was the CIO for Government of Canada, and Jim Balsillie. They were looking to form an organization that would be able to put out standards with respect to ICT quickly and efficiently, with the hoping to make Canada a leader in setting standards in this particular area. So members of the CIO Strategy Council include both public and private sector. You can go to their website. I've included it, and you can see who the members are. Microsoft is actually a member. And one of the things that the CIO Strategy Council does, one of their main objectives, is to develop standards through an open and public process to support Canada's IT ecosystem. And when I say open and public, it is very much open to anyone who is willing to participate. They have a policy committee that will take applications from anyone who's looking to put together a standard. The policy committee will decide whether or not they think it's something that the CIO Strategy Council wants to take on, at which point it gets handed over to one of two technical committees that will then work on drafting a standard. And there is quite a nuanced process through which these standards run, and that's all set out on their website. The CIO Strategy Council actually became accredited by the Standards Council of Canada in 2019, so they are an accredited Canadian standards body, and they currently have 26 standards that they are working on at various stages. I think it's 4 of those standards have actually been completed and have been published and adopted by the Standards Council of Canada, and you can see which ones those are when you go to the site. The other 22 are just in various stages of drafting and comments. And so the one that we're focused on at CANON is the Privacy Enhancing and Data De-Identification Framework, which fits within a 9-part data governance family of standards that CIO Strategy Council is working on. Part 1 and Part 2 have been completed, and Part 3 is at the stage that they call public consultation. And so there's a period that is a 30-day period ongoing right now, during which anyone can provide comments on this particular standard. And a number of us members at CANON are reviewing it and looking to provide CANON's comments. And the reason that we are going to do this is because this particular standard obviously purports to be a framework for identifying and mitigating re-identification, which is something that CANON has been, obviously, is one of our main objectives. You might recall, if you've attended any of our previous meetings, that one of our goals was actually to develop a code of practice. And so when we realized that this particular standard was out there in draft and open for comment, we saw this as an opportunity to work with CIO Strategy Council towards coming up with something that we think, we hope might be useful to our members and to other organizations dealing with these particular issues. And as you can see from our presentation and Adam's comments, it's a very nuanced process. And one of the other reasons it's important, I think, for CANON and others to comment on this particular standard is because once it is published, and if it's adopted by the Canada Standards Council, there's no reason it wouldn't be, this could very well be something that regulators or others are relying on as a benchmark for de-identifying information and for establishing risk associated with re-identification. And so I think it's important that CANON provide its comments on this particular draft. I can tell you that just very briefly, having spent some time looking at this particular standard, we have some concerns around just defining maybe a little bit better what its scope is, making sure that it's very clear about who the audience is and whether or not there are any components that might be missing. We also are looking to understand better how this standard fits in within the family of standards for data governance that CIOC is looking at, and really want to make sure that to the extent that this is going to be viewed as framework guidance, that it's going to be a useful way for us to address the kind of use cases that we've talked about in our submission to the Ontario or to the OPC, just for example. And so work is ongoing. If anyone is interested in joining our group, you can contact me directly. We have had one meeting already, and the comment period will end on July 31st. So we have a couple of meetings scheduled over the next 2 weeks just to consolidate our comments and get them in by the 31st. After that, there will be a meeting of the technical committee of CSOC in order to review all of the comments that are received, and then hopefully after that, then the standard will be produced with changes based on the comments that have been made. One thing I should mention is that these standards are, once they're published, they're living documents, so they are revisited on an annual basis, and they are open for comment at any time, even once they've been published, which is a little bit different than, say, ISO standards. So, we're sort of feeling our way around this area. I'm not an expert in standards, but just given the topic and given what this draft covers, I think it's an important thing for us to focus on. So happy to take any questions. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. It was just supposed to be an update. And if anyone has questions, I'll take them now.
One question, Nadine, for you is, so why is it so important to make sure that we get standards like this right? What's the impact on organizations?
Well, I mean, I think the impact on organizations is that they need something that they can actually audit to. So in other words, if there's going to be a standard, it should be auditable. There should be requirements that you can actually measure. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult as an organization to know whether you comply or not. And to the extent that this is adopted as a Canadian standard, you very well could have, certainly from a vendor perspective, you could have governments requiring that you meet this standard in order to respond to an RFP or to contract with the government. Could also be a standard that the regulators are looking to when they're evaluating a privacy complaint, for example. So if this is out there as the bar, as what's required, while it's not a statute, I mean, to the extent that it gets adopted by regulators, it could be something that organizations are measured against. And so it's important that it be something that is measurable and that actually covers the kind of work that we are doing.
Thanks, Nadine. Thanks, everybody, Adam and Khaled too. So what we'll do now is we've got 15 minutes set aside for some Q&A, and there were some questions in the Q&A in the chat. So maybe sort of going, this is sort of for everybody. So feel free if you want to comment. But, David had a question about the definition of identifiable information and whether or not, maybe this is for you, Adam or Khaled, whether or not you thought it was similar or analogous to pseudonymization or pseudonymized information that we have in the GDPR.
So the concept of identifiable information would fit within the broad concept of personal information, which as we've worked on with CANON, there's a continuum of identifiability. So to the extent that data is there's a de-identification technique or another PET applied to that data and it transform it, it could fall within that spectrum of identifiability. And we were very careful and I think feel pretty strongly at the steering committee level, the folks who've worked on this, not to use the term pseudonymized, et cetera. We just want to keep it's either identifiable with a spectrum of identifiability within, but pseudonymized data, as that term is understood in the GDPR, would be a subset of personal information and fit on that spectrum of identifiability, depending on the extent of the pseudonymization technique applied. I recognize, even as I'm listening to myself speak, that's incredibly nuanced and somewhat, in some ways, might be super technical. But I think that's articulating the way we thought it. And I'm looking at you, Suzanne. You were involved in that state of data document. You agree with the way I've articulated that?
Yeah, I think you explained it just right. It is a spectrum, right? And pseudonymized data is a version, an attempt by a jurisdiction to define something within that spectrum. So I think the fact that we have intentionally chosen not to use that term, and also to what Khaled was saying about not using the term anonymous or anonymization, because it just confuses things. So the spectrum of identifiability, sort of works, right?
And I saw there was a question that's related, or a great comment from Anita Feinberg about, well, what about if I'm getting the question right, but the use of the term de-identified, same point. We thought less is more because we're trying to demystify. It's part of our key objective. And we thought the more different terms you have, the more confusing it gets. And you could apply a PET to and transform the data. And depending on what you do, it'll sit within the spectrum of identifiability. But let's just keep to the simple terms. Personal information is identifiable data. And when it's no longer identifiable data, it's no longer personal information. And there's a simplicity and elegance to that I think, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of all steering committee members, but I think we all kind of like that. And we all, by implication, which has, again, significant impact for legislative reform, we instinctively say, when you introduce these other terms, drafters, you're creating more confusion. It's probably not necessary in order to achieve the statutory objectives.
Yeah, thanks for answering Anita's question as well. We've got a question in the chat from Jean-Francois. Again, it's all along the same sort of theme. So de-identification is usually not an absolute, but rather a determination made at a point in time for a particular purpose. So how do you best address this evolving state of the data and the associated risks that go with it?
Which is a great question. So that brings up, again, the earlier question, two things. One is, number one, we think you address it by simplicity in the terminology and just expressly recognizing and understanding the spectrum of identifiability. And two, it's a point in time. Well, it's not actually just a point in time. It's a point in time in a given context, in a given set of circumstances. So there's a contextualization that you have to do and look at. And then you look at the risks within that particular circumstances, the identifiability within those set of circumstances with the physical, technical, administrative controls and other measures and other factors that would deal with it. So I think that question is excellent because it brings up both those points and I think highlights the need for the simplicity on this. Personal information, a recognition that identifiability has a spectrum and continuum, and those terms should work on their own. And that allows for interoperability and allows for a demystification of what is otherwise a very confusing topic. And I remember the first conversation of CANON, our first meeting. This was actually the topic we had about how difficult we're having in business conversations where someone mentions the word anonymous or de-identified, and all of a sudden, half the meeting is wasted talking about what these terms mean or don't mean. And so we keep on coming back, and it seems to be bearing out efficacy to stay away from more terms, go with less, keep with identifiability, which is working now. It works as a concept, and then supplement that with codes of practice and other instruments or frameworks that would supplement and breathe life to the skeleton of a statutory framework in order to affect this in a practical way.
So Andrea was sort of making an add-on to Jean-Francois's question. How can we avoid a situation where this further broadens the space for interpretation of related legislation on de-identification? Because right now it tends to default to no action, or data sharing is better than risking non-compliance at the cost of innovation.
Well, first of all, that comment is excellent, because one of the problems now in the legislative discussion is you have somewhat of a polarized issue. Oh, it's privacy versus commercial interests, but there's very, very little discussion about, and there's some, but very little about the reticence risk that's developed by this. You create uncertainty. You have naturally the implication of that is reticence risk. And the prudent organizations who really just want to do the right thing, at some point for the more sophisticated, more involved types of data processing activities, they're going to say, this is more risky. Now there's a little bit of flexibility because the penalty regimes are just not the case. You introduce a regime where 3% of gross annual revenues is your ultimate penalty, if not 5%, but let's call it the 3%. You're talking for certain organizations, stunning amount of risk that is the potential out there. And if we inject more terminology, we will, my personal view is we will add uncertainty, it'll increase reticence, and you will have that serving as a challenge, if not a barrier, to organizations wanting to innovate. And the other thing that is talked about a bit, I would say certain folks are more vocal about it. There's certain stakeholders that are really critical of statutory regimes put forward. They say nothing about this. But the fact is that the innovation occurs in the private sector. That is the dominant place where the actual innovation and the data for good occurs that will benefit consumers, benefit the public sector as well. And so I think the approach that CANON has taken about simplicity on this is the way to go. And that with appropriate codes of practice, appropriate guidance document, continuing discussion, use of use cases, et cetera, exactly what we're doing right now, that will serve to demystify and reduce uncertainty.
So Anita comes back and says that, she agrees with the value of simplicity of the terminology, but it doesn't allow for different controls application of the legislation to the continuum. How do you fix that?
Yeah.
And maybe the answer, Adam, is you don't do it all in the law.
That's right. What we've been talking about at CANON is the law is not the place to deal with the different types of applications that will be necessary in different circumstances, because we want to future-proof the law. So we want to have it as basic principles, and we want to build on the very strength of PEPIDA, right? Is in many respects it's principles-based. And then we deal with it as with supplementary instruments or communities. I think we should look at this broadly, right? Supplementary instruments like codes or practices such as assessments that would be done, as was identified as a common technique used for the circumstances. In the circumstance, the assessment is done, risk mitigation measures suggested, recommended, implemented in the circumstances. Not easy stuff. I certainly don't want to give the impression I have the answers. I'm just talking about the themes we've discussed at CANON and that have also sort of manifested itself in client discussions.
Did anybody else want to add anything to all of this conversation we've just had? I've got a couple more questions here. So to what extent are we assessing this implementation feasibility of these proposed standards in selected jurisdictions?
Well, I think the fact that we're starting by understanding the practices that are in place today, we know that these practices feasible because they're being used today. So we're trying to ground this in reality rather than in terms of our comments for standardization efforts or any efforts that we work on. We want to ground it in reality, and I think part of this work that was presented today is or this work presented today was part of this effort. So I don't think feasibility is going to be an issue.
Sorry, and Suzanne, if the question relates to the feasibility or implementation feasibility of the draft standard that the Strategy Council has put out, then yes, obviously that's a huge piece of what we're looking at, and it's one of our main comments, I would say, on the overall standard is that when we read the provisions set out and the requirements, it's difficult as it's drafted right now to understand exactly what it is you as a user of the standard is required to do. And that's one of the main themes of comments, I think, that we have with respect to various sections of this standard. It's hard to implement. You look at it and aren't quite sure, first of all, what you have to do. And then secondly, how would you ever measure some of the requirements?
Great. So with that, everybody, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I think we've had excellent presentations, lots of questions. Thank you, everybody. And, super to have this second formal CANON event. And I'm hoping that we'll have more and we won't wait a year next time. So Khaled, maybe over to you to formally close us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And we will be sending everyone a link to the recording. So we should be able to get that out in the next couple of days, as well as a link to the copies of the presentations that were given out. Also, you'll get that in the next couple of days. And if we maintain our current cadence, we'll have another event next summer, but maybe we'll try to do something sooner as well. There's a lot of activity and happening in the country around new regulations and statutes coming up. So I think CANON will be busy and we'll definitely try to organize another event to present the membership's perspectives and views and contributions to some of these efforts. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne, for moderating the session, and Nadine and Adam for your presentations, and hope to see everyone at our next event. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks.